Greetings, this is Gwen-Webber-McLeod, the President and CEO of Gwen Inc. and the proud host of The Leadership Journey, Living and Leading in and on Purpose. Guess what? It's that most wonderful time of the year. Yep, not Christmas, the tax season. And I don't know if you're anything like me, but this time of year can often be really filled with stress and concern about getting things done. And because one of the attributes that I look for in the most talented leaders I serve is calm, I invited someone to be on my show today to help us think about how to be productive and stress-free through the tax season and beyond. I'm so proud to introduce Chris Belfi, who graduated with highest honors from Rice University in 1998 with a triple degree in computational and applied math, statistics, and economics. Upon graduation, he joined a major international oil company and worked for 16 years in various corporate finance roles, including strategic planning, cash flow analysis of assets and investment opportunities, and performance management and reporting. His major accomplishments include quantitative analysis of bid levels in highly competitive license auctions and the valuation of an asset sale valued at over $500 million. Having always been interested in finding ways to get maximum potential with less effort, just over 10 years ago, Chris started studying and practicing techniques for maximizing his personal productivity and significantly improved his effectiveness as a corporate finance professional. In 2010, he began informally teaching these techniques to others in his organization to help them also achieve increased levels of success. In 2015, he left his corporate finance career and founded MaxPotential Coaching LLC to pursue his passion for helping others achieve new levels of leadership and of success by teaching them the best ways to accomplish more while working less. Well, Chris, that's quite the resume that you sent here for me to take a look at. And I'm so excited that you can be here with me. And, you know, I'm always talking to clients and hopefully the people that are viewing and listening to our program just about the importance of being confident, competent, courageous, and calm. And I know personally and in working with other leaders that this time of year can be particularly stressful because most leaders are juggling their day-to-day work, their families, and having to prepare for the tax season. So I'm so excited you're here to be with me this afternoon. Welcome.
Thank you, Gwen. I am excited to be here with you as well.
Thank you so much. So you know what? A lot of times people don't know what coaches do. So I'd like to first of all, have you begin by telling me a little bit about yourself and what led you to be a productivity coach. Because when you look at your resume, some might think that that would not be a natural outcome.
It's true. My story is a little bit convoluted at times. So I'll just step back a little bit and tell you about it. I think back to early 2001 because that was sort of the starting point for me. Because at that time I was living in London. I was working for this huge oil company. And of course we had to have performance appraisals at the beginning of the year for the previous year. And that performance appraisal that year was actually very memorable to me because I was informed that certain parts of my job at least, were considered below expectations. And honestly, that was a bit of a surprise to me because unbeknownst to me, I had actually let things fall through the cracks. It hadn't necessarily followed up on exactly what needed to be finished and what people were expecting. So, as I said, that was a memorable moment because, as you just mentioned, you know, I have a fair amount of polish to my resume. I graduated from Rice with highest honors and so forth. And so below expectations was not usually the way I did things. So what did I do about that? Well, first of all, I just tried harder. I tried harder to manage and remember and remind myself of all those different things that needed to be done. And what I found was that did help me keep out of trouble. But it didn't exactly launch me to a new level of success. And so what I didn't realize at the time is that I really needed a systematic approach to managing all my commitments to make that work really well for me. So fast forward about 5 years, I finally got some good corporate training, probably a 2 or 3 day workshop in time management and productivity. And what I realized from that training is that there's certain techniques that you can apply to this problem. And I had not realized that. And so the system that they taught me in that class, it was effective for some people, but it didn't work great for me. But what I knew is that I needed a system. I needed a structured approach to managing everything. And so I went looking for something that would work for me personally. And what I stumbled across was a book called Getting Things Done. So today I'm going to talk a bit about this Getting Things Done approach. And I need to mention that Getting Things Done and the shorthand for that GTD are trademarks. And they're trademarks of the David Allen Company. And I am not a certified or approved or recommended or associated with David Allen Company. But I have been studying this for over 10 years, and so I have a lot to say about it.
Well, that's great. I'm really, really excited to hear more about this. So you were on this journey. Sounds like you were working in corporate finance, doing really well, highly successful based on your resume. And so you get on this leadership journey, and I think there's always sort of this catalytic moment that pushes us towards doing something we have great passion for, or as we talk about here on my show, living and leading in and on purpose. So say a little bit more about what happened what made you decide to leave, this corporate work and move into the field of productivity coaching?
Great question, Gwen, because honestly, I really enjoyed corporate finance.
Yes.
And, but what I found was that as I was practicing this approach and I was improving my performance and I was taking on more responsibility, I noticed that because I was in big teams and knew a lot of people, I noticed that there were other people around me that could really use some help, because once you start noticing things, like with leadership,
yes,
you probably start noticing the people around you and how leadership applies to everything that you see, right?
Yes.
And so for me, it was productivity. And so I noticed this. And so I was thinking, how can I help the people around me? Because that really wasn't part of my job description. But I could do a few things. I could do a lunchtime learning session. I could do little bits of informal coaching. And for example, a lady sitting next to me, I helped her with working with her email better. And what she told me a week later or so was that suddenly her email no longer made her angry. And I knew that was something that was not just going to help her for a few weeks, but actually probably for a long, long time. And so as I continued to do this, I honestly figured that was going to be how I did this, was I was going to be the guy who was in corporate finance and did a little bit of productivity work on the side. But then, of course, everything changes, right?
Right.
And so back in 2009, January 2009, I married my amazing wife, Marcy. And at the time, she was a PhD student in Austin, and I was working in Houston. And that's about 150 miles away. And so we bounced back and forth between Houston and Austin for about 5 months until she finished her coursework. And once she finished her coursework, she moved to Houston because she was going to do her research and her dissertation from Houston, not having to live in Austin. That's a fairly normal thing to do once you get to that point in your PhD program. Well, 5 years later and 2 children later, we realized that she hadn't made any progress. And so we had a very important, courageous conversation about that situation. And what we decided was either she needed to quit the program and move on to something else, or we needed to move to Austin. Now, we decided that we were going to move to Austin and finish this degree. And so the first thing I did is I started talking to my company about working part-time. And they were happy enough to let me do that, and I was grateful that they did that. And so we moved to Austin, and I worked part-time, but I was still going to Houston, and I was in Houston about 2 nights a week. Now, at this time, our kids were 4 years old and 18 months old. And so while it was in some sense workable, it wasn't exactly ideal. So 4 or 5 months into this arrangement, I had the opportunity to volunteer to be laid off under, shall we say, very generous terms. And what we decided in that moment was that the best thing for our family was for me to be full-time in Austin, and for that would be where we would live. And so what I did was that I made a decision. And I decided that I could either get out my resume and try to find another big corporate finance group to work with, or I could do something completely different. And I decided that I had more passion and more interest, actually, in working in this space of productivity.
Wow. I think your story is so interesting and exciting, and I think that there are kernels of it that will be really inspiring and inspirational to other folks watching this podcast that might be interested in jumping into living and leading in and on their own purpose. And I think the fact that you made that courageous decision is really, really powerful. And I'd like to say that often you hear stories from women who have made similar decisions, and I'm so excited to have you as a guest, a male guest, who is also talking about that it is possible for men to look at ways to be flexible in their careers, flexible in how they work in partnership with their significant other or wife or partner as a way of getting on the path to their purpose. So tell me a little bit about what exactly does a productivity coach do?
Sure. So productivity essentially means making progress towards meaningful goals.
Yes.
And what a productivity coach does in general is help their clients make that progress faster and with less stress or less energy. And so that's a very high level description of productivity coaching.
Yes.
Now, I only know a few productivity coaches, so I certainly couldn't speak for all of them. What I can tell you is that they do this in different ways with their clients. Mm-hmm. And what I focus on specifically is I focus on managing the detail level of your life in an incredibly effective way so that you can be more focused more easily. And it's that focus that then creates the opportunity for you to make more progress faster, with less stress and less energy, and often with less money involved. Mm-hmm. But whatever it is that's getting in the way, the focus is what creates the opportunity.
Wonderful. So I started my show by saying that it's that most wonderful time of year, tax season. And as you know, and I know in my own personal life, just trying to manage everything in a productive way to focus on this singular, very important task, it's increasingly difficult as my president and CEO-ness kicks in, as I often say. So, we're going to talk about productivity in general, but I'd like for you to really talk a little bit to our guests about ways to be productive during this time of year. So here's the deal. It is tax season, and so many people are juggling organizing their taxes on top of their careers and family. So how can we reach this goal of finishing our taxes faster and with less stress? And for this one, Chris, be really specific because people watching might be taking notes.
Absolutely. So Gwen, there are 3 essential steps to getting to that goal. And so the overview is, number 1 is you have to beat the procrastination. And you have to get started with actually pulling all your information together. Number 2 is you have to set yourself up to make progress on your tax data in just, say, 10 minutes a day, because that makes it easier to do it without getting overwhelmed. And number 3 is you have to keep yourself going. And so you have to set yourself up to keep yourself going, and that way you can finish early and actually avoid the stress of that last-minute rush. So let me dig a little deeper into that.
Yeah, would
okay?
you please? I'd like to know more.
So taxes are something that a lot of people procrastinate about. And there are probably 1,000 different reasons why people procrastinate on taxes. But I think that there are at least 2 really big ones. Number 1 is that taxes tend to be a complicated process. Mm-hmm. People don't procrastinate as often on things that are super, super simple. Number 2, there are bad consequences if you get it wrong. And so when you put those 2 things together, you have a reason that people want to avoid even thinking about taxes, right?
That's true.
But the good news is that if you have a solid approach or a process, you can actually avoid a lot of that stress and the overwhelm and the procrastination that goes with tax season. And so let me tell you some really specific steps to go through to beat that procrastination.
Great.
Okay? First of all, we beat procrastination by starting small. And so the way I want to start small is I just want to create a checklist. And that checklist is going to be just a list of all the information and the documents that I need to hand over to my tax professional or to have in place to actually start filling out forms or to use TurboTax. But I'm not telling you go do your taxes. I'm saying just create a checklist. And so we're going to break that down even further, okay? Because create a checklist, there's different things you might need to do first to actually get started on that.
Yes.
Okay? So depending on your situation, there are different possible first steps. One possible first step is find that information organizer that you built last year and make a copy of it. If it's in paper, you can make a copy of it or photocopy it. Or if it's electronic, just make a copy of that file and start getting rid of the old data so you can put in the new data. Another possible first step is go ask your tax guy or your finance person for an organizer or a checklist for your taxes. That's a pretty easy step. It's a phone call or an email. Another possible first step is search the web and find a tax information checklist. If you go to Google or another search place, you can find one of those really easily, just like search on income tax checklist. Or even another possibility is pull out last year's tax return and just look through it and remind yourself of all the things you needed to make that happen last year and start making your list from that.
Right. I think that whole thing about procrastination is such an important thing to think about. And I'm really kind of giggling and smiling as you're describing it, because these are things that are just so simple to do. And even with myself, I have to fight procrastination all the time. But just to think about it, when you describe it that simply, it's sort of like, boom, you should have had a V8, right? But I think to have someone remind us that these are just the great first steps to take that will catapult us towards the next thing is really, really helpful. So press on. I think we really need to know more.
Yep. And so what we've identified here is one key to beating procrastination is to identify that very specific next action.
Yes.
Something as specific as just go search for something.
Right.
Go pull out a document. And so you don't need to, quote, do your taxes. You just need to do this one little step to get started. So that's the first piece, is the checklist. The second piece is setting yourself up to make progress really easily. And to do that, we're going to take that checklist and we're going to see that now when we look at our checklist, there's a limit. There's a boundary around our taxes. The checklist might be 5 pages long or it might be 1 page long, but at least it's not 10 pages long. So we know how big the problem is. And so having made that checklist, then we're going to jump in and figure out how do we make progress with that checklist. And so for every item on that list, you're going to look at that item and you're going to decide what is one very specific step I can take to move forward on getting that item checked off. So for example, is it a document I need to go download from my bank website? So the simple step is go to bank website and download 1099 form. Or is it something you're waiting for? And so are you just waiting for your W-2 to come in the mail? Or is it that the W-2 is actually now late? And so the simple step is make a phone call to the right person to figure out why your W-2 hasn't arrived.
Right.
And so for every single item you've identified on that checklist, you go through and you determine what is one very simple action you can take to move it forward. Okay? And so once you've gone through that entire checklist and you have a very simple action for everything on it, now you are set up to make progress.
Yes.
Because now you can pull out that list, and in only 10 minutes a day, you can start making progress towards that finished goal of having every bit of tax data together that you need.
I think that that's really powerful when I think about it in the context of the kinds of folks that I work with and in my own life. And I think that often what prevents us from tackling something that in our mind feels very major, and I think taxes are major, I don't think that's a fantasy, is that we get overwhelmed and we often think that we have to do everything all at once. So I think inviting folks to break this down into a series of small steps and then to act on those steps gives you some affirmation that you're winning, that you're moving in that direction. And when you think about the types of people we both work with, being successful in getting things done is really important to us and to them. And so creating ways that they can have that small win and that success is really critical. And what's interesting about that, Chris? We do that all the time in the workplace, right? When we're doing strategic planning, we say, let's set people up for small wins. But in our own life, sometimes we forget to take care of ourselves in that particular way. I think there's more to come. Keep going.
There is more. And what I'll say about the 10 minutes a day is that if you start in January or February,
yes,
then 10 minutes a day should be all you need.
Right.
Now, we are about a week away from filing deadline, so you may need more than 10 minutes a day if you're starting today.
Right.
But it still is going to be small chunks and small wins, one win at a time. So when you get to this point where you have this list of very concrete next actions, we call them, and you start going through those lists and you make progress in little small steps, one at a time, then at some point you actually have to go back through that list and refresh it, because you'll have checked off one step towards getting this form or this piece of information, but you won't necessarily have identified the next step. And so every day or two, or every week, depending on how quickly you're moving ahead, you need to just go through that form, that checklist you made, and reevaluate, okay, where does each of these things stand? Are some of these things done, checked off, completely taken care of? Great, make sure they're checked off. Are some of them now in a place where you need to do a different action? So you decide what is that next step that needs to be identified so that I can have another small win and move it forward towards finished. And so the third step in this process is to keep yourself going by refreshing that list of next steps, so you always have some step available to move every little bit forward.
Yes.
And if you keep doing that, sort of do a rinse and repeat. You do a rinse and repeat. And then eventually, if you keep taking enough steps, you will finish every single one of those items, and you will be done with creating that full set of data for you to hand to your tax accountant, or have all that data ready to go fill out forms, or exactly however you do your taxes. And so that really is the totality of what you need in terms of a process to get your taxes done, and to get them done without stress and without overwhelm.
You know, one of the things that I think about often is that how emotional money can be for people. And it doesn't matter whether you have it or not. It always makes people really emotional. And one of the things that I observe, Chris, is that because money can make people experience shame and guilt, that's another thing that I think sometimes feeds into why people procrastinate around an important process like filing your taxes or other activities that we engage in to be fiscally fit. And I often reflect on my decision to bring a financial advisor into my own life as a business owner, and what an emotional process that was. And my advisor, her name is Lee Gatta, actually invited me to come speak to a professional association about my journey to making the decision to be a financial advisor, to have a financial advisor, and to really take control and tap down the emotions that come with choosing to be financially fit. And I think all of those same emotions impact how we think about approaching tax season. So do you find that your productivity strategies get people sort of out of their heads and their hearts and their guts about it, and really allows them just to take this on as a technical task that will help them get through and just get done?
That is absolutely correct, Gwen. By focusing in on those very small steps, we essentially, in some sense, almost dumb down the process.
Yes.
So that we don't have to think about the whole thing.
Right.
And so it's really the thinking about the whole thing, especially for those people who are extremely creative and sensitive. It's that thinking about the whole thing that gets you from the thought about tax form to the thought about jail in about 10 seconds.
Exactly.
Right? And so that sequence of thoughts happens very fast.
Yes, it does.
If we can just focus you down on one very specific item, then you're less likely to have that massive jump that can create the negative emotion that you're talking about.
Absolutely. I call that catastrophic thinking. It used to be a skill that I have, and I still manage on occasion. But I do think that that's so true, that when you hear people talking about this time of year, there's almost like this soundtrack of, you can almost hear it grinding out for people. And that's exactly what happens, is that they go from thinking, oh my God, I don't have this done, to having this catastrophic thought about not getting it done. When again, if we just put a framework and a process about it, it can help the busiest of us get things done. So I want to continue down this path a little bit, if that's okay.
Sure.
So talk to me about other productivity skills and techniques that can just not only help us in the area of financial fitness, because that's one narrow lane. I just think in general, every one of my clients talks to me about being overwhelmed, not getting things done, having a to-do list that's really about 5 legal pads. So what other ideas or suggestions would you have to help people improve, if you want to speak again about financial fitness, or just generally? How can we become more productive in our lives and take that from concept to action?
Sure. So last week, I actually, because we were going to be talking about this, I actually had a chance to ask some financial advisors about, what do the clients they see actually struggle with.
Right.
And so a couple examples came up that I thought would be really helpful to talk through from a productivity point of view.
Yes.
So one of those areas was the idea that at a general level, people can be very reactive and not very intentional about their finances.
Yes.
And so one technique that can help with that is to start by just capturing your intentions and capturing what's on your mind. To notice what financial things are on your mind and to just write them down. Make sure that they're not simply floating in your brain, coming up at the most inopportune moments and distracting you from whatever you want to be focused on, but rather that you put them, we start by just writing it down, putting it into an electronic file or someplace, again, outside of your brain. And so, for example, you might have this idea of an emergency fund in your brain. And so if you write it down and then start thinking about what is my intention about that?
Yes.
What outcome do I actually want to achieve related to this idea of an emergency fund that keeps floating through my brain? And so when you go to that level of thinking, then you can identify what do I really want to finish or achieve related to that thought. And that might lead you to defining what we might call a project called, build an emergency fund of, say, X dollars. Okay? And having that defined is much more helpful than having the thought emergency fund to sort of flash through your brain at semi-random points in the day. And so define that specific outcome gives you something that you can finish.
Right. You know what I love about your thought process about that too is the piece about being intentional about it. Because I do think that what gets people off track and causes some stress and probably causes procrastination is that we think we need an emergency fund, and instead of defining it from a place of intention, the fact that we don't have it starts to trigger guilt and shame about, oh my God, why don't I have it? That then triggers that catastrophic thinking, right? So I think that that's really wise to encourage people to document that from a place of intention so that it's seen more as a resource than just another task you have to do that could trigger some feelings in you that would prevent you from doing it. Sure. Am I kind of getting what you want me to get?
Yeah.
All right.
I think it's important that, and from my point of view, it's important that anything that we have intention about is something we've defined in a way that we know when we're done doing it.
Yes.
As opposed to more vague, we can have really vague ideas that honestly we never know when we're finished working on them, and that leads to sort of a treadmill kind of phenomenon where we kind of keep doing something and we never know when we're supposed to stop.
Yes.
Right? So we don't want to end up in that spot.
Not
certainly.
at all.
And so, you want to define, once you define that outcome, you also want to define concrete action steps, just like we talked about with the taxes. So we need to determine, what is that first little step I need to take towards building that emergency fund. And of course, having decided that that's something we want to finish, we do need to monitor our progress in at least some very general sense of, say, checking in, say, once a week, and deciding, and checking, so where am I on this? Do I know what the next step is? Or do I need to figure out what the next step is? Because if I never check in on it again, it's likely that it will just sort of go back to one of those things I worry about rather than work on, right? And so that is the whole checking in on things you're trying to finish is actually a big deal, because I'm sure that in working with leaders, you sometimes work with people who have to set annual goals.
Yes.
Or probably they all have to set annual goals.
They do.
And how many of them say set annual goals and then don't ever look at them for, say, 6 months?
Right. Well, I'm a strategic planner. I do that professionally. And the minute an organization contacts me to do strategic plan, that's the thing. I call it strategic plan fatigue kicks in the minute someone says it, for that very reason, that they've created this plan, they've created this document, they've documented all of these goals, and never once have they returned back to take a look at them. So I think there's so many analogies between what we do in our personal lives and what really goes on in people's professional lives as well in this arena.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
Press on.
So one more specific gap that one of the advisors identified in terms of financial fitness is estate planning. And so if that's you, then you could have what we call a project, which would be something along the lines of, create an estate plan with all the necessary documents created and filed away. And so the question is then, where do you start? And of course, where you start kind of depends on your personal circumstances. And so it might be that if you're just starting to think about estate planning, the first thing you would do would be just decide on an action, which is search the web for some general information about estate planning.
Mm-hmm.
Or you might already have an expert that you work with. And so your first step might be to talk to your attorney or your financial planner about estate planning. But we want to even drill in on that even more detail, because we want to make sure that, because talk to can be a little vague, because we might actually have an intention, or the answer might be we want to just send them an email and say, hey, when should we talk about estate planning? Or what should I know about estate planning? Or you might be in a place where actually I want to call their office and set an appointment and go and see them.
Right.
But those are two different actions. And
right.
until we decide which one we're actually doing, we're not going to make progress.
Well, you know, it's funny when you talk about that, because it makes me think of this book that a colleague of mine is reading that really invites us to think about the distinction between knowing something and doing something. And I think that so much happens in this arena as well, that we know we should do something, but getting to that place of doing it is difficult sometimes. So I think that these strategies will also help people think about concrete things that they can do to close that gap.
Yep. And let's say you're going to have a meeting
yes.
with your planner or your attorney about estate planning, then a great thing to do at the end of any meeting, especially this particular one we're using as an example, is to always ask at the end of a meeting, what are the next steps?
Yes.
And, we don't want to settle for vague answers when we ask these questions. We want to know very concretely, coming out of a meeting or out of a conversation, what are the expected next steps that move us towards the goal of, say, a complete estate plan. And if we don't ask those questions, then we will probably be disappointed with the outcomes that we get.
Right.
So those are two examples that I have related specifically
right.
to financial fitness.
And I think that those are two very good ones, because so often people that are managing and leading are heading in a direction where they're starting to earn more money, wanting to be more effective of it. And one of the things that always helps me be comfortable about talking about financial fitness, although just to be honest, I, like every other leader, struggle with, staying on track and keeping on track, is actually having someone in my life that helps guide me and my husband to those places is really helpful. But I think that these aspects of our personal life can get so entangled. I think leadership becomes a way of life about the time you become a mid-manager, that it can be really difficult to transfer things you do every single day in your job, for the most of us, right, to be successful, to actually concepts and practices that we would weave into our personal lives. And I really enjoy the fact that you connect taking these steps to this attribute that I think is critical, this competency of calmness. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more about some other productivity tips that you would just generally give someone. I know when we first met, and you said something so simple to me, and it made me laugh hysterically, because I don't think people think about it, is when you kind of said to me, well, Gwen, when you have an email inbox, the goal is for it to be empty. And I just laughed so hard at that, because I can't tell you how many of my colleagues, my clients will say to me regularly, some of them have hundreds of emails still in their email box. And sometimes I know I have in my mind, would approach that goal as saying, oh my God, if I can just get through 5 of these, and not necessarily focus on the idea that I really won when there's no emails in my email box. So would you talk a little bit about other productivity tips that we can apply to this, or just other areas of our lives?
Sure. And just on the topic of email, I've had clients with 10,000 plus
to
work with. So, it's
I don't
all
want to be
relative.
them.
It's all a relative problem.
It really is, yes.
So the first tip I would offer is to essentially eliminate this particular sentence from your vocabulary, which is, I'll just remember that. The idea that you will just remember something rather than writing it down or capturing it in your phone or wherever you like to capture information is one of the big impediments to people's ability to focus, because they're using their brain as their organizer.
Right.
And that is not what your brain is good at. And it's a very good way to have your brain interrupt your focus with random thoughts about things that you're trying to remember. And so what I suggest is you always carry some kind of notepad or other tool to capture ideas and thoughts and things you need to do. And, I've usually carry something, fairly small with me. When I have my bag with me, it's a full-size notepad. But the key is always be able to capture that.
Yes.
And the second thing that goes along with that is to have a tray on your desk where you actually put those notes if you're using paper notes. And so you can tear off the notes from the meeting, the notes from the last 10 minutes of random thoughts, and you put them in that tray so that you know where they are and you have a specific trigger to come back and review them and think about what actually needs to be done about them. Because if you don't put them there, what you end up with is you end up with legal pads that have 20 pages of notes from 15 different meetings. And having tried that in the past, I can tell you that it doesn't work very well. I'm sure we're not describing any of your clients, but people
As a matter of fact, you
people
are.
you know.
So, along that lines, a book that I read that really inspired how I approached doing that, Chris, I read The One Thing by Gary Keller. And he has a very similar philosophy, and he really believes that we really need to organize our lives around those vital few things that Gwen-Webber-McLeod, are the only one that can take care of, to call that my success list, and then to create a to-do list of tasks that I could do later or delegate to someone else. And so as I started applying these techniques in my own life, I actually did introduce them to one of my clients. And part of this process invited them to bring their to-do list to the meeting, and someone did walk into the meeting with 5 legal pads that had pages and pages and pages of things that this person had documented but never managed or completed. So I get that in real time.
Absolutely. And so we really just want to have one place for these things. So if it's just one app or one type of notepad that you typically use, then that's what we want, is we want to collect them in as few places as possible, because we don't want our entire house to become a collection point.
Yes.
And so the downside of using, say, electronic apps is that it can be harder to remember to go back into those notes and actually decide what to do about them.
Yes.
So that's my first tip, is stop trying to remember your to-do list or anything else of any significance to you, and make sure you have an external way of managing it.
Right.
The second one is to make checklists for repeating tasks. And we already talked about taxes. But really, just about anything that repeats and you can't do it perfectly if you're half asleep probably would benefit from a checklist. For example, the taxes, packing or preparing for travel. And that's not just what you need to pack. It's also, in some cases, more importantly, all the different things you need to do to be prepared to leave town.
Yes.
Because I've often had done great packing and forgotten that ahead of about a day ahead that I needed to find where we were going to board our dogs.
Right.
So my kids have a nightly activities list, because even though we do it every single day, we're really busy in the evenings. There's lots of things we're trying to take care of, and we're probably pretty tired. And so if we don't have that list in front of us, it's really easy to forget something that's at least fairly important that needs to happen part of the kids' nightly routine. For example, onboarding a new client can be an opportunity to have a really powerful checklist. I think this applies especially to people like financial advisors who have somewhat complicated processes, but even for less complicated processes, myself, I have a checklist for sort of introductory conversations for setting up new client engagements, because it's easy to forget one or two little details that are important enough that you're going to have to email somebody a second time or can make an extra phone call if you forget them.
Right.
And so we can just save ourselves that extra stress or time by making sure we get everything into the first conversation.
I totally agree with that. And I even talk about using those kinds of lists, Chris, with my clients who are onboarding new employees or onboarding people into new management or executive positions.
Yes.
Because that is one of those things that I think people say, well, I'm just going to remember what to do. But inevitably, when I take on a new client and I say to them things like, how did you arrive at this position? How did you get prepared to take on that position? I will tell you, so often people say to me, well, Gwen, I showed up at work. The first day they opened my office door and were kind of like, go in there and do what you need to do. But I think that is so critical to think about a list that really is connected to onboarding new clients or onboarding new leaders into their positions, because they're so right. There are so many things we need to do to prepare to actually bring the person in. And then once they're in, we should have a guide of some sort that enables us to make sure that they're intro into the organization goes as smooth as possible. I'm really glad you mentioned that as an example.
Yeah, and there are even sort of other topics that you might not necessarily think of as, traditional common checklists,
yes.
but they can be very helpful. For example, you could have a checklist of people you want to keep in touch with.
Yes.
Which is just something that you read, you look at it once a week or every 2 weeks, just to remind yourself of these are people I have intention about trying to keep in touch with, and check in, well, have I kept in touch with them as much as I feel comfortable with?
Right.
And that doesn't mean that you're going to trigger a phone call every week.
Yes.
It just means that you're maintaining that at the level that you think is appropriate. And so there's all kinds of different ways to use checklists and to powerfully make your life easier and more effective. Another tip you can use is just don't lose cool, interesting ideas that you're not ready to do anything about. Just because you have an idea and you're not ready to, say, start planning that vacation to Hawaii or Barcelona or wherever it is that you really want to go someday, just park that idea on a list maybe labeled someday maybe. And when you park it there, you then are not going to lose that idea, because otherwise, you could have cool ideas about music to listen to or movies to watch or books to read that you just kind of lose. And there's an opportunity that's lost there if you don't have some place to put them, that you'll be able to come back to them when you really want to.
I actually used a strategy like that when I was incubating the idea for Gwen Inc., and it wasn't a list. I just kept a folder on my desk.
Yes.
And as I would allow myself to imagine this ideal company that I would want to own at some point, as I came across ideas or had thoughts or saw pictures, I would just drop them into this folder. So when the day came that I decided that I was actually going to bring this idea to fruition, being able to pull out that folder that had lists and pictures and ideas in it really helped me shape my thoughts. I think that that's another great strategy to use.
Yeah. And you could even, as I said, you could use it for travel destinations.
Yes.
You could use it for blogs that you wanted to read at some point. You don't have time to go read them anytime real soon, but it's like, oh, I really want to check out that blog on leadership or cooking or, international, travel or whatever it is. Podcasts you want to listen to someday when you have a little more time.
Yes.
Or even, I suppose you travel a fair amount.
Yes.
Are there any cities that you travel to on a fairly regular basis?
I'm finding myself in the immediate area around Buffalo and Rochester, but I'm going to be spending a lot more time in Seattle over this year. So I'm really excited about going there.
So for example, as you start traveling to Seattle, and people may tell you when they hear that you're going to Seattle, they say, oh, when you're in Seattle, you need to check out this restaurant, or you need to check out this museum, or you need to check out this really cool bookstore. Then you can have a list that just says next time in Seattle, and just remind you, oh, here's some places that people mentioned that I could check out if I happen to have time. And next time, it's not a commitment, right? It's just some interesting ideas that you don't have to lose, and you can always have available when the right time happens.
Yes.
And so that's another really cool way to sort of, shall we say, be more productive in a way that people don't usually think of as being productive, but it really does allow you to get more out of life, and out of more of what you want, without missing opportunities.
Yes, so as you do your work with your clients, I always say to people at the end of my work, so as a result of having this interaction with me, I will or what will be different about you. So what's some of the feedback you get from your clients about the outcomes of having you be their productivity coach? What are the things that they're really enjoying, and what's the needle that gets moved as a result of you supporting them in this way?
Well, at a general level, people tend to report being less overwhelmed, feeling less stressed, and generally kind of making more progress day to day, week to week. There's a couple of interesting stories I could tell you. I'm always about a good story. So one of my first clients, he was a solo lawyer at the time that we met, and I worked with him, and it helped him organize his law practice in terms of just how he was working. And one of the things we ran across when we were working through all the different things and ideas he had, things to do, was there's some other business that he had in mind. And as a result of working with me, I think he started making more progress developing that other business. And actually now I think that other business is actually what he's doing now, rather than being a solo lawyer, which is a really interesting outcome, I think. And I don't know that it would have happened if we hadn't sort of helped him elevate his game in sort of managing the whole of his work and his life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What about something else? What's other feedback that
Sure.
you get? Or another
Sure.
story? I think when you talk about it through that lens, it helps people. I always kind of say to people when I'm working with them, well, what does that look like? So I think it's important to share some stories about what it looks like to have the impact of a productivity coach. Please feel free.
Sure. So again, another one of my clients is a real estate broker, and she has about 6 kids. I lose track because many of my clients have 5 or more kids, and so I don't always remember who has how many.
That alone is a reason to have a productivity coach.
So one of the things that she reported was that she found it much easier to switch focus because her kids would come home at, say, around 3 o'clock, whatever that time was, and she wanted to switch focus from real estate business time to family time. And so what she found was it was much easier for her to switch focus because she wasn't thinking about all those things that she might not have taken care of that day that need to get taken care of. And so she was much more able to be focused on family when it was time to be focused on family.
Yes.
And as a bonus, she also found it was much easier to get to sleep at night because she had fewer of these, did I remember to return that phone call or send that email, floating in her head again at the end of the day.
Yes.
And then another family with 6 or 7 kids that I, again, can't remember. I worked with the husband, and we implemented all these different techniques, and he went home and he worked with his wife implementing the same techniques in their home, and his wife actually really liked it. In fact, he says that she's actually further down the road than he is now on that journey. And she says that she's generally just maybe a little happier person.
Yes.
Because their household is a little better managed.
Right.
And so those are the kinds of results that I love to hear about.
Yes.
And actually one more I can think of is, I had a client email me after a call and said, I forgot to mention, I feel like I'm able to be more engaged with my daughter when she comes home from school because I feel like I got more done during the day, and so I can be fully focused with engaging with her when she's home from school rather than sort of being sort of partially engaged with her, I guess, and partially just trying to still get other things done.
Yes, Chris, I think that's so powerful that that's the feedback that you're getting. Because in my work, one of the challenges that I see with people who are emerging and established leaders is being what I call fully present, allowing themselves to be mentally engaged and present right where they are. And as you're describing those scenarios, what's really coming up for me is that when people aren't focused on productivity in an organized way, it's very difficult for you to be fully present at home and or at work. I can imagine, because you always will have that drone of trying to remember, what didn't I get done today? And it makes me think about an inspiration that I share with people to really focus on excellence and not perfection. And I think that frankly, perfection kills. I really do. I think if you get too over, it can really kill your spirit, kill your energy. But when you're organized and you focused on excellence, that I have my list and I'm going to set out the intention every day to do as much on this list as I possibly can. And then when I'm done doing that, it gives me some way to say, you have to celebrate yourself, be so proud that you got those things done, and it will allow you to switch in that way. And so much of what you're describing will enable you, those of you viewing it, to do this thing that I called live one life. Because none of us are truly separated at work or at home. When I'm at work, I'm wondering, what are my kids up to? What is my family up to? So the more you can put an infrastructure around your life that allows you to get things done so that you can be fully present mentally where you need to be, is one of the things that so intrigues me about your work. Because in the end, it's just men and women like us who have families out here in the workforce every day trying to get things done. And I just see so much tension and stress in that whole arena of work-life balance, which I believe is a myth, right? I don't know that I think you're ever 50% anywhere. I really like to think of it more as a counterbalancing act. But I think the techniques and tips that you're giving us will be really helpful. So talk to me a little bit more about what you see as the future of your business, because you said you don't know a lot of productivity coaches. So I think you've got some products in the works here. You could create the to-do list, and I'd certainly buy the checklist from you. But what are some other hopes and aspirations? I know you're kind of new to the area. You're in Aurora. But I'd like you to tell people how to be in touch with you and to talk a little bit more about where you like to see your business go.
So to be honest, it's very much the early growth stages of my business.
Yes.
And so what I'm looking for is the opportunity to take on more clients and get to a point where, I have a sort of steady stream of clients.
Wonderful.
And that, maybe my calendar, I can look out on my calendar and see, full, as many clients as I was expecting to have over a couple of months in advance, rather than sort of one at a time.
Right.
And so that's sort of my number one goal at the moment. And there's some other things that are in the works that I'm probably not ready to try to describe yet.
Yes, I understand.
So I'll just leave it at that.
Right.
But right now I really am very focused on one-on-one, high-impact, work with business owners and executive level leaders to help them.
So how would someone get in touch with you?
Right. And so the best way to get in touch with me is via email. And so the way to do that is chris@maxpotentialcoach.com, or you can look at my website, which has my contact information, which is www.maxpotentialcoach.com. And that has some description of the work I do, as well as my personal, my contact information and so forth. So that's the easiest way to get in touch with me, certainly.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you so much for coming here. And before I wrap with our inspiration, I just want to say, Chris, thank you so much, that I don't think it's an accident that we met at this very moment, because I'm certainly contemplating ways that I can be more productive as my company is growing to the next step. I think we all get at these interesting tipping points. And I really do think that the thing that will help us move our businesses or our lives forward is to really focus on how to be more productive around things that we've set intentions around. And I also want to say that I hope that anyone out there that is maybe dealing with some of the things that Chris has been talking about will really reach out and obtain his support. My company tagline is that because leadership is not a job to do alone. And it really doesn't matter how smart and talented you are. The more you start to really achieve those things you intend to do, I think it creates more of this interesting kind of chaos in your life. And I think it's critical to bring in people to support you, even when you're at the top of your organization and the best and the brightest. Before I go to my closing inspiration, I would really like to extend an invitation to support my work here and my podcast here. So if you or your organization is committed to developing confident, competent, courageous, and calm leaders, or sharing your own stories about the legacies of leadership you're trying to create in your own business, please feel free to reach out to me. I have a very interest in learning more about leaders in the Finger Lakes region, and I'd love to have you as guest on my show. Also, we're really focusing on diverse leaders, and I'm really interested in what's going on in the lives with emerging leaders and millennial leaders, and even student leaders, so we'll have some of those kinds of guests. But please feel free to contact the producers of my show for details on becoming a guest or even sponsoring my show. So if there's an opportunity for you to showcase something that you do as a sponsor, please feel free to be in touch with us, and you can get in touch with my producers at info@gweninc.com. The other exciting news is that we're going to be hosting monthly virtual roundtable discussions prior to each podcast episode. And so this month coming up, we're going to be interested in connecting with women on the topic of mothers as leaders. That will be my topic in May, mothers as leaders. So we'll also be getting out some detail on all of our social media platforms about how you can be part of that conversation. And once again, please contact the producer of The Leadership Journey for additional details at info@gweninc.com. So, I always like to close with an inspiration, so here's one for you. I happen to be a bit of a hip-hop head, and there's a hip-hop artist that talks about keep your mind on your money and your money on your mind. And I think today's guest, Chris Belfi, certainly gave us some strategies about doing that. But as a point of inspiration, I'd like you to think about the ideas that Chris shared with us as a self-care strategy. Because so often we think of self-care as candles and baths and chocolate and wine and shop therapy. But I also think that what really is causing us stress sometimes are issues around money, or issues about other folks in our lives who are zapping our energy and not giving us energy. So as you're keeping your mind on things, certainly keep your mind on your money and your money on your mind, because it is a self-care strategy. But overall, keep your mind on those things that help you be the most productive, satisfied, intentional leader that you desire to be. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Gwen-Webber-McLeod, President and CEO of Gwen Inc., and the proud host of The Leadership Journey, living and leading in and on your purpose. Have a great day, and we'll see you next month when we're talking about mothers as leaders.